on the streets of the South. This weekend, a fierce debate is raging over how you protect those vulnerable people and how you tackle the whole issue of a hidden trade. In the past few days, the Berkshire MP, Fiona McTaggart, has made an unsuccessful attempt to amend a new anti-slavery bill in the Commons. She wanted to include a clause which would criminalise the clients of call girls. It's a controversial proposal, but she's pledged to fight on by enlisting help from the House of Lords. And here she explains why.
The reality for prostituted women is one of violence, of a high risk of rape, of many of them being at risk of being murdered by their clients. And it seems to me that what we should do is, instead of seeing prostitution as a problem of naughty women and that the effort of the police should be directed at prostituted women, the time should be to reduce the demand for prostituted women. What you would do is you would say that to offer payment for sexual services is an offence, so that the woman who was being sold isn't an offender, but the man who has some choice, who's trying to buy her body, is. In the Commons there was resistance to the specific proposals that I made. So let's be clear, this isn't just a choice of career. I've yet to meet the girl who wants to grow up to be a prostitute, or the mother who looks forward to her daughter's future as a prostitute. What we have to do, I think, is to clearly find a way of building the national consensus about what works to reduce this exploitation and violence towards women. And so I hope that what their lordships do is vote for better information, for a national, perhaps even a royal commission, and that actually, men don't feel free to buy women's bodies.
Oh, well, with us in the studio, Niki Adams, who represents the English collective of prostitutes. What do you think about what she's doing there and saying?
Well, we're very opposed to the increased criminalisation of prostitution in the way that Fiona McTaggart is proposing because, first of all, on the grounds of safety, we have seen already how laws against clients actually undermine safety for sex workers, force prostitution underground, prevent sex workers from actually employing safety procedures that many of us use day in, day out of screening clients. You've seen in Sweden where the law was introduced, which is claimed as a success by Fiona McTaggart and other people, but in fact one of the key things about that is that they didn't ask sex workers what they thought of the law and how they thought it was working, and many of them describe a massive increase in stigma and discrimination, it being much harder to protect ourselves. The proposal doesn't talk about decriminalising two women working together in premises, which is a much safer way of working. It only relates to the street. And this measure was opposed by a very wide coalition of very prestigious organisations. You know, the Royal College of Nursing, the Women's Institute, a whole set of people came together and said, we are fearful that this would actually make it more dangerous for sex workers to work.
Well, you talk about safety, but by treating this as a business, you talk about women working together, aren't you actually putting people at more risk? Because you're suggesting that people who are exposed to exploitation and violence, very vulnerable people, are just like anybody else going to work each day.
Well, there's a couple of things about that. Fiona McTaggart's figure that she often uses, which is that 80% of sex workers are trafficked or controlled by a pimp, is an absolutely ludicrous and ridiculous figure.
Would you put it at?
I think it's much, certainly not 80%. Until prostitution is a very underground business at the moment because it's actually illegal. A lot of the aspects of it are illegal, although prostitution itself isn't illegal.
What proportion
so it's
of
very
anyone
hard.
Involved in the sex industry really wants to be doing it?
I think it's a very similar decision that you make in other forms of employment. You know, it may not be a great choice, but it's the best choice at this moment in time. 70% of sex workers are mothers. That tells you something about the nature of the
tells
job.
you something about how desperate they are.
Well, also that you need, that it's a kind of job where you can earn a bit more money, that is flexible hours. There is exploitation in many other jobs. Nobody's proposing to clamp down on those forms of employment as a solution. And what we want is that the violence, the rape and violence that some sex workers do face, to be tackled, but not there to be a blanket criminalisation of what is essentially consenting sex. There has to be a distinction between prostitution and rape, prostitution and violence, prostitution and trafficking. They're two very different things, and you should focus on the violence and ensure that sex workers' efforts to keep ourselves safe are actually supported.
Conor Burns, you were looking at this anti-slavery bill. Do you think it was right that this was brought into that as well? These people are victims. They're often trafficked, although there was a dispute about how many.
The thing that worried us, I sat on the Bill Committee, which examined the modern-day slavery bill line by line. The thing that worried those of us and the government was we didn't want to actually confuse what we were trying to do. This is a ground-breaking piece of legislation. We are internationally taking the lead in tackling modern-day slavery, and we didn't actually want to reduce the focus onto the very, very narrow point simply about prostitution. That was the principal reason.
But you still think that there was an element of it, and maybe, that Fiona McTaggart's wider point, but what do you say about this idea that criminalising paying for sex could take a step forward?
Well, I think it's an interesting idea, but I think the arguments are balanced, and I think the arguments that have just been advanced are very powerful. And with respect to Fiona, I think this lady knows a lot more about it than she does.
Well, OK, but you say that the Swedish example...
I think that is a major problem, that sex workers' voices haven't been heard sufficiently, and I think we take great objection to being called prostituted women.
Yes.
I mean, many women working in the sex industry have made a conscious choice, have decided on this kind of work compared to other forms of work, and would like support for our own efforts to keep ourselves safe. We have situations where women do come forward and report violence, and instead of getting the protection they're entitled to, they face prosecution themselves. That has to absolutely stop.
What about these European experiments? Keith, the Swedish example is often quoted. If you criminalise the person paying, that's a way forwards.
Yeah, well, I think the important thing to do is to consider the welfare above all else.
That's right.
of the sex workers.
Yeah.
And, the issue, the prostitution is exploitation, and the sex worker is made more vulnerable if the perpetrator thinks that they've got something to worry about. They risk prosecution.
Right. So you would agree with Niki on that?
Absolutely. Not only would I agree with that, I've certainly supported the Greens in the European Parliament when we voted to legalise prostitution and not criminalise one party in it.
Right. All three of you. And Niki, thank you for coming in.
Thank you very much.
Now, it's the one